Welcome back to Double Fries No Slaw. We have Doug Rohan of Rohan Law. We'll talk more about them in just a minute. But a big day, a big week for Florida State. This is probably our third or fourth video on this week. But getting Doug on because there's no better way to, unfortunately, I guess, wrap up this for the time being. This FSU ACC lawsuit settlement fight is now coming to an end. Doug, I don't want this to be too much of a victory lap, but I do have a Heineken 0.0 that I'm going to crack to start. It is alcohol free though, so I'm on the clock. But I am cheers because I am going to take a sip as we get started. But a good day for FSU.
Absolutely. We're real pleased that everything has worked out the way it was reported yesterday that was going to work out. Again, I'm sorry to put you off 24 hours, but I just wanted to make sure before we hopped on and before I put my name behind anything that we got as much good information and accurate information as we could. And at the end of the day, it was along the lines of what we hoped for. In fact, it was even a little bit better than what was initially reported. But yeah, and going back and thinking about the dozens of hours of videos that we recorded. It's validating to know we were right. I was called, by a couple of naysayers, just an ambulance chaser, and this wasn't my forte, my contract, my area of practice. And I was upfront with y'all from the beginning, but nevertheless, the legal principles still held, and mediation and litigation all kind of fell in line, just like it does for our personal injury and work accident cases. And it came out about how we had expected this to come out over a year and a half ago or so.
Yeah, again, not to pat ourselves on the back too much, mostly you. I was just smart enough to hitch my wagon to somebody who made a lot of my credit is very limited on this, but you talked about this a lot. The settlement was most likely, we didn't really know if and when that would happen, but as we got a little further into this, I mean, thinking back to December of 23 when we first started, as we got further into it, I mean, you continued to point towards that February 1st date. And I think what's so telling, and people, oh, well, why would other ACC programs agree to this if they're not Florida State and Clemson, North Carolina, Miami, right? That figure to be at the top of some ratings standards that'll get you more money. I would be pretty remiss to think that ESPN didn't have a pretty heavy hand in this. All of the information that has come out this week was leaked kind of around the time of the ESPN settlement. And it very much seemed like ESPN, I don't want to put words in their mouth or say that I know what happened in those meetings, but it very much seems like ESPN signed the agreement with the ACC, understanding what was coming shortly after. And that would be a settlement with Florida State and Clemson, and probably got the thumbs up, whether that was from arm twisting or whatever ended up having to happen, probably got the thumbs up from the rest of the league of, all right, yeah, you renew your deal. We'll vote to change the payouts, and Florida State and Clemson's lawsuits will go away. We'll at least have stability for the next 5-6+ years, maybe even further, depending on what happens past 2030. But it seems like that kind of targeted, hey, watch for what happens around the ACC ESPN deadline ended up coming to pass with everything you had kind of projected.
Yeah, were very clear on your last show talking about the 2-1 extension, the extension, the opt-in provision by ESPN, that I was certain there's no way ESPN would have moved forward with that without at least an outline, a framework, a memorandum of understanding. Look, this required the board of trustees to meet, vote, for all the schools to sign off on it. That type of movement takes a lot of time to coordinate, and all of it has to be based on a document, a written agreement, a settlement agreement that takes hundreds, if not dozens of hours at least to prepare, go through drafts, get everybody to agree on the language. So while we pointed to February 1st as being the deadline for a settlement, and I was personally disappointed that the settlement wasn't reached on January 31st, it still was far enough along for ESPN to feel comfortable with it, for them to then dot the I's and cross the T's over the last 35 days. And then look at who reported it, who leaked it. It was all the ESPN reporters that had the most accurate information. So you're right. It's not a surprise. It's not a shock. And I'm certain we will learn more about how this worked in the background in the future. But ESPN had a very heavy hand in seeing this through to completion.
When you think about the numbers, right, and what's being reported right now is that 100, not even necessarily just reported, like Clemson reported these numbers themselves in their board of trustees meeting, which was happening simultaneously with Florida State's. we're looking at $165 million to exit the conference in fiscal year 26. Not that we necessarily anticipate that, but that is essentially the buyout, right? When we had tossed around the $120 million number, that was a projection based on multiple years of revenue. That number it balloons up every year. So 120 and 23 is 140 and 100 and 24, 155 and 25, however, it's all based on revenue of that current year. 165 million, essentially, I mean, it's just the buyout, right? Like, I mean, the grant of rights, this ironclad document, that's FSU Twitter's favorite word this week. Essentially, Florida State's, if you had it all to look back at again, would you say that their strongest case was that the grant of rights was just a theoretical, their strongest argument in the case was just that the grant of rights was kind of a theoretical, imaginative, use the right word, document that they wouldn't be able to keep rights once a team left and everything. Like, that's essentially what they settled for.
It's always fascinating anytime you venture into a new legal field, into a new legal area. This concept of the grant of rights is relatively new. When we talk about property rights, when we talk about contract rights and contract laws, those date back 100, 150 years. They've been litigated. They've been refined. They've been attacked. They've been shored up. So those long-standing principles under the law can sometimes date back all the way to Magna Carta and the original foundation documents of European countries. So to start off with an idea, a novel concept of a grant of rights is interesting, it's shiny, it's new, but it has to be litigated. It has to be forged in the fires. It has to be analyzed in the context of judicial opinions. And so far, we have very limited case law on the grant of rights. And so what you end up having is a situation like this where some people were very adamant that this was ironclad. Some people were very adamant that it was the plain language and the plain reading. But then go back to our first few shows. We were shocked at how strong these arguments were. We were shocked at the angles and the strategies that FSU was taking to attack what appeared on its face to be ironclad. And the bottom line, as we sit here today, is what I would characterize as close to a total victory as you could get in a settlement. I know people wanted to be playing in the SEC this year. That was never going to happen. That was never possible. But these numbers and this agreement does make 2028, 2029 feasible. And what I've been saying on Twitter today is on the heels of Oklahoma and Texas and their shift to the SEC and all the conference realignment that took place out on the West Coast, there really needed to be a period of the settling. There needed to be a period of the calming of the dust and seeing how these seasons played out before the next round of probably bigger and grander conference realignment. So it lines up perfectly with the 2030 time period, 2031 time period, because we will be presumably, that's a big if, the haters can attack us, but we presumably will be in a new landing spot by 2029, because you want to be in the conference before you're negotiating the new contract, the new TV rights deals, which means we'll be announcing in 2028 or potentially 2027 if we want to make it a more orderly transition. So to announce a departure to a new home in 2027, we're only talking 2 seasons, 3 seasons before we're at that point. And the most important thing of all of this is that with the numbers reduced to writing, with the guarantees, with the agreement, Florida State can start talking to people today. Now that we have the resolution in place, we don't have to play cloak and dagger, cute games, behind the scenes, secret handshake agreements. We can start talking about what's next because we know what the price is, and we will not be, despite the other attorneys' wishes and desires, we will not be sued for tortious interference as a result of our decision to leave the ACC.
That's a pretty big point, and I hadn't really thought about that. Hadn't really seen much on that. Just the idea that Florida State doesn't have to, they don't have to be tampered with, right? Like, it's not recruiting where you're telling an agent or an NIL collective member, like, oh, well, if we enter the portal, we would take this. If you know your price and it's all agreed upon now, and you understand what it takes to get out, there is no, like you just said, interference. Like, it is just hey, we're negotiating for our next deal. It's similar to what, remember Colorado was, I don't know how much you followed the Pac-12, Big 12 stuff, but it's what Colorado was doing very much open, on the open market. Like there wasn't a lot of, their media rights deal was expiring on X date. And they said, hey, we're negotiating for beyond that. We're not necessarily doing stuff in the dark. And so that's an interesting point that I hadn't really considered. With this and just kind of the thoughts around it, do you, I know that we at times wear garnet and gold colored glasses, right? There's no doubt about that. But I do think we've been pretty fair when things are good for Florida State, when things are bad for Florida State. If you take off the garnet and gold colored glasses completely, I don't see how there's any way other than maybe people whose expectations would be that we'd be playing SEC football in August, right? The Bama game would be a conference game. Other than that expectation, I don't think there's any other way you could spin this other than being a huge win for FSU.
The only people that think this might be a loss, the only people that have concerns, are the ones that hope we don't have a landing spot somewhere. And what we've seen from the numbers, what we've seen from the data is that we're one of the most attractive partners that exist out in the field. So there's going to be some interest in coming after Florida State. Now, follow up with another 2-win season, a 1-win season, a 0-win season, and perhaps that begins to change. But that's all that the haters can hope for. They want to see us fail, and that's fine. Keep watching. Those hate-watching Nielsen ratings work just as well as the people who love watching Florida State.
It was pretty interesting to me that they even said that in the I don't know if you got a chance to watch the Board of Trustees meeting, but they even mentioned that, like the people are watching. They said something like people are watching us, whether they're watching us because they love us or hate us, like all the views matter the same, which I thought was hilarious coming from a Board of Trustees meeting. Cause that's a very TJ Pittenger thing to say, like, hey, watch us too, right? Hey, if you're watching Double Fries right now because you hate us, that's okay. They said that in the Board of Trustees meeting and I about spit out my drink. It was a good thing I was muted when it happened. Got some questions on Twitter here. And listen, I'll tell you this, as much as I appreciate your time and probably appreciate that the most, the best thing about this has been the fan interaction. We wouldn't have kept doing this. I would have just called Doug Sell to find this info out. So I guess we would have done it, but not broadcasted it. The people that engaged with this series over, almost 18 months, the people that continue to comment, the people that continue to ask questions, like that's the only reason we kept doing this. So I do have a few Twitter questions that I'm appreciative people sent in. Here's one from Noah says, could the ACC be hopeful that Florida State and Clemson might stick around by giving them this settlement? The path to the playoffs is obviously easier in the ACC. And if the money gap is not too great, could the league end up having success the time new TV contracts come up and come around?
It's certainly possible. I'm not going to say it's not possible. Highly unlikely. And it is all dependent on what ESPN wants to do when it renegotiates its contract. Remember, their unilateral extension is through 2036. So we're talking about a locked in discount price for the ACC for an additional 5 years after they renegotiate the increased prices for the SEC and for the Big Ten Conference. So I cannot imagine a scenario where ESPN either wipes out the contract and starts the ACC contract all over again, certainly not for an increased price. But if you look at the eyeballs, the charts that have been circulating, I've seen 2 different charts going around Twitter this week. There's a very clear delineation between the Notre Dames, Clemson's, Florida State's, Miami's, and the rest of the conference. We're talking about almost double the numbers of viewers for those partners. So those 4 members plus UNC plus any travel partners that need to go with any of these teams that leave, they're going to be looking for the SEC and the Big Ten. Now, it's possible. Sure, I will entertain the possibility that neither the SEC nor the Big Ten wants Florida State. And in that case, yes, the ACC for now is the next best option. And yes, increased payouts are something that's going to be needed to make the financials work out. But why would ESPN do that when you have so much in the bottom half of the conference struggling for any reasonable viewership numbers when compared to the Ole Misses, the Mississippi States, the Alabamas, and the Georgias. I mean, they're not in the same realm. We need to be playing those opponents for our numbers to be justifiably as high as the rest of those SEC numbers. And I do believe that would happen. You plug Florida State into an SEC schedule, and you are going to see SEC viewership of Florida State games in the top third.
Yeah, if you were to replace, I mean, and they don't even have to be the Bamas and Georgias, but if you replaced, not to dump on programs, but Wake Forest and Boston College with South Carolina and Ole Miss, right? Like Tennessee, right? Like kind of your second tier. We already saw what LSU did in 23 and 22. Yeah, it would be otherworldly. J Miley 22 may have had my notes before this. Do you think the ESPN was involved in the settlement agreement telling that lower tier schools would agree to this, or basically they're not going to renew and then fight for yourself after the 2027 extension that didn't happen would be up? ESPN certainly holds all the cards and will be able to kind of dictate which brands stay in the ESPN umbrella when and if they do leave the ACC. Unless you disagree with it, kind of what I was saying too. Like, it seems like ESPN was pushing pretty hard for there to be some more certainty, and as a way to convince the Wakes and the Boston Colleges and the Syracuses to agree to give up money. Saw some projections that they could lose up to $7 million a year, which for programs that make less anyway, a big amount of money. Feels like ESPN was pushing pretty hard there.
I would take it a step further, and I think part of this negotiation and this process, ESPN and the Big Ten already know who their targets are, who they want, who they're interested in. And by suppressing those payout numbers on the back end of this conference, they've given themselves some flexibility on when to execute the departure. So I would say not only was ESPN very likely involved in the closed room negotiations about this deal prior to their exercising the option, I think they've already kind of hashed out with the Big Ten who's going to go where after the 2030 season. I would be shocked if people aren't already making their plans for when this drops to a $75 million buyout.
The other question I want to get to, Nole ATL. So Atlanta Nole here. What is the ACC's perspective on this? So this is maybe the inverse of the first question I asked you from Twitter. ACC's perspective on this, does it feel like it's just delaying the inevitable to where they've just kind of started a 5-year doomsday clock? What is the ACC's win in all of this long term?
One of my favorite things to have seen today and this week is all those people that were calling us crybabies and I can't believe you're doing this and you signed it are now the ones that are saying the ACC is inept, ineffective, feckless. That's our SAT word of the day, one of the ones we've shared in the past. Now they're calling the ACC leadership feckless. Yes, we know this. We've been aware of that. We've been trying to educate you about that issue. With that being said, the ACC, they're a cancer patient trying to prolong life as long as possible. And the ACC will continue to exist. The ACC will be a conference in 2040, probably 2050. The question is, what are they going to look like and who are going to be the other parties that they're on par with? If you bring in a Memphis, you bring in a USF, you're not replacing Clemson and Florida State. If you lose North Carolina on Tobacco Road from your lineup, you're not going to have the basketball acumen that you had before. So the question is, does the ACC survive as a corollary to the AAC, or does the ACC do enough in the next 5 years to elevate their status to be in that second tier of conferences with the Big 12?
Yeah, I know you. I think you're going on the Big Mountain, which those guys do a phenomenal job. And that's what Steve told me, right? When I asked him kind of that question a month or so ago, it's not about, you're never going to replace, but at this point it's about survival, right? Mm-hmm. And I think I agree with that, right? Like, we all want to see the ACC's demise because we're all just petty, right? But at the end of the day, when we're out, I don't really care, right? But to them, it's not about, there will be no way to replace what they're going to lose or what we would expect them to lose. Whether that we would assume it includes Florida State, but whether it includes Florida State or not, right? They're never going to replace, but can they survive? I would tend to lean towards yes, right? Now, if leadership is important and if they don't have the right leadership, they will go the way of the Pac-12 and they will cease to exist. But even the Pac-12 is going to find a way to survive in a very different way with the Mountain West. And so they'll survive. It would take some catastrophic failures to not capitalize enough to at least exist, but they certainly aren't going to survive in the way that they are right now.
All it takes to survive is an open bar at media days before the season starts. That created the most buzz of all of the things that they did at the start of the season.
I was very glad to partake in that. So no real big complaints there. What are your thoughts on just in general the landscape that this kind of creates to maybe start to produce super leagues around that 2030 year? I got some DMs about that, some questions about it. Just thoughts on the Big Ten, the SEC kind of paving the way, this agreement kind of paving the way toward that.
I'll leave it to your college football addiction show. I have not really gotten into the study of that and gotten well versed in where that's going. That's far more speculative on my part. I would just say, in some regards, we're kind of already there. Adding another 4 teams or 2 teams is not going to be an earth-shattering occurrence. We already have a Power 2. Now, the question is, does that Power 2 refuse to participate in a Division I wide championship program, or do they create their own championship program? That is the earth-shattering decision that's going to be made in the next decade. But we're not very far from a P2, which all started with the ACC capitulating on the Florida State snub. That was the moment that the Power 2 was really created.
Yeah. We talk about money, and I really need, I don't know if you've done much with the Big 12 Mafia or not, but the Wild U puts together some really good graphics and infographics on numbers and dollars and things like that. I really am interested, in talking about some of the specifics of the settlement. The idea that Florida State and Clemson and really any team like Wake Forest wins 12 games the next 6 years, they're going to be up there too. Any team that is bringing in more eyeballs and winning more because the success initiatives are not going away can have an opportunity to earn more money. I really wonder how much this closes the gap. You had mentioned, again, ding, 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 Doug was right again. If we could get around that 10, 15, $20 million number of closing the gap with the Big Two for the next 5 years while we're presumably in this conference, it feels like a pretty big win there to at least have the opportunity. Now, Florida State needs to take care of their business on the field. We all understand that and need that for our mental health, or else you're going to turn into, better help with Rohan Law. It's that opportunity and that number that you had kind of pitched of closing that gap feels like, hey, we won't get so far left behind in the next 5 years.
I'll imagine a best case scenario. Best case scenario is Florida State meets the viewership obligations and gets the first $15 million. Then a success initiative for making it to the playoffs. It might be far-fetched. We'll see how Castellanos does. And gets a couple $1 million for participating in the playoffs. And then on top of that, or for the success initiative, and then on top of that gets the playoff payout bump. If we're managing to get 2 teams into the playoffs and make a deep run, now what are we adding? 25 million to the total pot for Florida State in terms of total additional revenue. You add that to the regular payout and you're on par in 2025 and 2026 with those SEC teams. Now, of course, that gets it to the SEC baseline. The SEC gets to add 9 teams that are in the college football playoff. So they get 9 times the payout or whatever their number ends up being. So yes, they will leapfrog and continue to leapfrog. But if the concern was how does Florida State close the gap with the SEC baseline schools, this for the next 2 years is equal to or in excess of what that baseline is. Again, they will continue to get ahead with more playoff participants and with more viewership successes as well. But it does a really good job of getting us to where we wanted to be when we started this litigation.
For sure. Yeah. That's a great point that you bring up and something I've tried to remind people of and tried to during the Board of Trustees meeting. It brings you a lot closer on media revenue. The playoff, just the ACC only getting 2 versus the SEC and Big Ten splitting up 8, 9 teams. Like you're getting a smaller piece of pie too. The ACC is not paid the same per participant Neither is the Big 12 compared to the Big 10 SEC. But that's another battle for another day, right? And if you're only stomaching a few years of that, you're probably, that's not your major concern. The difference in those numbers is like the SEC. I think last year the SEC made like $8 million more per team than the ACC did on who went to the playoff. 8 million is a gap, right? And it's certainly nothing to like turn nose up at, but it's not the $40 million gap plus the 8 million that we were maybe worried about 6 months ago or a year ago. And so you can stomach 8 to 10 million per year. I mean, shoot, Florida State's already been doing that, right? So you can stomach that. Anything else big picture? We'll wrap up and let people get out of here. But anything else big picture you want to touch on before we go?
No, TJ, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed this ride. I've enjoyed getting to know a lot of Noles through this process. It's been very pleasant to be well received by so many Nole fans. And, we tried to speak the accurate truth about what we were seeing and about what we knew. And I think we were rewarded by those interactions you mentioned on Twitter. We have a lot of long-term followers. We probably won't be doing more than one or two more videos as we talk about maybe what comes next. But for the most part, this is our sad farewell and goodbye. I was here as an expert on the litigation, and the litigation has ended. We knew this day would come, and success, we are here.
Well, expert or not, we're going to get you back on after Norvell's in Atlanta. We're going to get you back on to talk about football too. Like, I'm not letting you off the hook that easy. People may yell at you even more for football takes, but that's all right. We're still bringing you back. I'm sure you've been yelled at plenty in your career. So don't say goodbye just yet. May not be as frequently, but we will certainly have you back on. And we appreciate you always making time, always coming to hang out. And Doug has, done this from the mountains, done this from vacation, done this from all over the Southeast United States. And so we appreciate you for, you've been backpacking and texting me updates and stuff. So yeah, we appreciate you a ton because it doesn't happen without you. We've done this every time, so we're not going to not do it now. Tell us a little bit about Rohan Law and anybody that could maybe use any help.
At Rohan Law, we want to be your best friends on your worst day. If you find yourself in Atlanta with some challenging concerns about the law, you've been arrested or you've been hurt at work, or you have some friends or family members that just need to know who is a good attorney and who they can call that's got a good reputation, we're here to be a resource for you all. Just like I was a resource for you throughout this process, we truly like helping our Noles and Nole Nation with their legal needs, but it is limited to the state of Georgia. One of the reasons we didn't start this initially when you and I talked, we didn't want to build a whole bunch of followers when everybody is in Florida watching. But as it turns out, we had a whole bunch of Atlanta Noles, largest alumni group outside of Florida, and it really has been rewarding to be able to talk to so many of you, not only about the litigation, but also for those that have needed my help over the last year and a half. So please follow us on Twitter. Please follow us on Instagram. Follow us anywhere that you do the social media, and we'll continue to be in touch and help out with any way that you need us. Yeah.
Go hit Doug's comments on Twitter and everywhere else and tell him thank you, but make sure you're following him there.
The receipts are coming. I will say the cherry on top of this. I've been too busy yesterday and today with all this, but as I get a chance to catch my breath later this week and this weekend, I've got some receipts to be sharing. I know you already started unloading the clip today, but I've got some choice ones to send out as well.
Heck yeah. So the best way you can say thanks to Doug is go follow him on Twitter. And again, if you are in Atlanta or really just anywhere and you need a referral, like Doug will definitely get you taken care of. And my only regret is not being able to crack this thing open because I drank too slow on the first one. So Doug, we appreciate you, man. We'll talk to you soon, and go Noles.
Go Noles.